So a little about us. Baltimore Racial Justice Action is a network of Maryland individuals committed to social transformation with an emphasis on racial equity. BRJA was officially founded in 2003 and had its roots in the Agents of Change workshops that began in 1996. Also here at BRJ, we offer workshops for members of the public, consultation for organizations, and free monthly dialogue events on the intersection of race and other societal issues. To learn more about our public workshops, consultation, or 13th of the month events, visit us at bemoreantiracist.org. We are a nonprofit and we appreciate all donations that we receive. You can visit us at bemoreantiracist.com/donate to send a donation. You will find the option to sign up for automatic monthly donations and to become a BRJA monthly sustainer. This allows us to continue to give free monthly events. Okay, before we jump into our question that we have up here, we're going to turn things over to Toya. She is a local conjure woman and hoodoo practitioner here in Maryland, and she has been willing to do a libation ceremony for us today. Since we're going to be talking about slavery here in America and the emancipation of enslaved ancestors, we felt like it was important to lift them up, to honor them, to center them as we begin this conversation. And Toya, I will turn the floor over to you now.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Can you see and hear me just fine? Yes, okay, good. All right. Thank you to Michelle for inviting me to do this, for welcoming me into this space. I do not take it lightly that I am here to represent my ancestors, some of whom were enslaved in what is the state of Maryland. Most of them, though, were folks from South Carolina and from Georgia and from Virginia who made the Great Migration here to Maryland. And I sit here now as a member of the Chesapeake Conjure Society. You can follow us on the web. We have, our website is hoodoosociety.com. We are at Chesapeake Hoodoo on Instagram. We are at Hoodoo Society, I believe, on Twitter. And we are a group of practitioners of what is a African diasporic tradition and religion, which has been passed down to us by our ancestors who came from all different nations on the continent and then came here and became a new nation because of enslavement. So we give all honor to them. Michelle asked me to explain what libation is just a little bit. Libation simply is the pouring of liquid to honor our ancestors and our spirits. It is always appropriate to do it with cool water, which is what I'm going to be doing today. But also you can pour spirits to the spirits. And so you can use things like gin. You can use things that are culturally appropriate. So for people who are from the Caribbean, for example, they might choose rum. My folks like whiskey, we from the South. So, you know, anything that is culturally appropriate to your people is always good. And keep in mind that when I speak, I'm always speaking from an African perspective. I'm always speaking from a Black perspective. So the traditions of libation, whether they are poured at all, how they are poured, etc., change according to who your people are. But speaking for my people and in my tradition, this is what libation is. And so I have libation for today to honor the space that we are all in together today. And I'm going to go ahead and do that. You will see me looking down because libation is poured on the ground. Why? Because that's where our ancestors live. Their bones are in the ground. So in our tradition, we tap on the ground to signal to them that we are talking to them, or we shake something. I have a maraca that I like to shake when I'm calling them. Or also I have my ancestral staff, which I will just on the ground to notify them that we are talking to them now, that we are honoring them now. So any of those things will work, just to let them know, hey, we speaking to you and we're coming together to honor you at this time. So you will see me looking down because I am pouring water on the ground. You can either pour it directly onto the ground, or as I will be doing today, you can dip your fingers in and just kind of lightly fling the water onto the ground. So that's what I'll be doing today. So let's all kind of come together and focus on what I'm saying, because I'm going to be honoring my ancestors and the ancestors of many of us at this time. Okay. As we gather in this place together, we give honor to this space. May this space be cool. May all roads be cool, and may the owner of all roads be cool with us. May our heads be cool. May our spirits be cool. May we be receptive to all the blessings our ancestors and our spirits have for us. We pay homage to the creator of our various understandings. We pay homage to dawn, and we pay homage to dusk. We pay homage to the earth. We pay homage to the ancestors who now reside in the spiritual realm. We pay homage to the mothers, and we pay homage to the fathers. We pay homage to the ancestral spirits of the North, of the South, of the East, of the West. We pay homage to our collective African ancestors, stretching back to that first African woman who gave birth to us all. And we pay homage to the Native ancestors on whose land we now stand. May you rest, may you rest, may you rest. We pause at this time to give honor and praise to our collective ancestors in this area. All honor to Harriet Tubman, all honor to Frederick Douglass, to Sandy Jenkins, to Aunt Zippy Tull, to Eliza Foote, to Old Pete, to Leanna Davis, to Burning Eve, to Augusta Chisel, to Margaret Gregory Hawkins, to Gladys Marie Fry, all honor to our great ancestress, Gloria Richardson. I pause at this time to give honor and praise to my beloved dead, to my granddaddy, Nathaniel, and to my Aunt Cheryl, and my stepsister, Aisha, and my grandmother, Ida, and my grandfather, George, and my great-grandparents, Bertha and Reese, my great-grandparents, Phyllis and Wash, to Emma Jane. Ibaye to all the Smiths, the Hawkins, the Nicholsons, to the Hollimans, the Boones, the Walkers, the Browns, the Gambles, the Deschamps, the Andersons, Ibaye Tarun. We pause at this time to honor all our beloved dead, to give honor to Mary Elizabeth Cornish Elsie, to John Thomas Elsie, to Charles Ennis. We give honor to Nathaniel Nace Hopkins. We give honor to all the beloved dead and the ancestors of those here gathered. We honor you today. We honor you every day. May your names be spoken forever. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Toya, so much for that, for centering us, bringing us into this space of honor and reverence to our ancestors. That was beautiful. Before we get into talking about the history today that surrounds slavery here in Maryland and the emancipation process, the legal emancipation progress, I want us to be thinking about and reflecting, what have you been taught about slavery and emancipation in the United States, in Maryland? Maybe you have been taught very little. Maybe you have been taught a lot. Maybe you've done some self-work, some and some investigating on your own about this topic. But I want us to be thinking about what we've been taught and how much we've been taught and what that means. So I just want to take a few moments now for us all to reflect on that. So as we go forward today, talking about this history, I want us to continue to come back to thinking about the things that we've been taught, the things that we believe about this topic, the thoughts we already had coming into this topic before we got into the history. So as many of you know, Juneteenth has gained popularity across the country in recent years, for good reason. But Juneteenth was actually about the legal emancipation of slaves in Texas. But Maryland has its own Juneteenth story. Some of you may not know, but as a country, legal emancipation of slaves happened almost like in like a patchwork piecework way. It wasn't like, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and everyone was free. It wasn't like that. And so in Maryland, slaves were freed on November 1st, 1864. And that's what we have gathered here to talk about today. We're going to be watching a short clip in a little bit that's going to go into more of that history. But before we go into the history, I want to talk about resistance. And the reason why I want to spend time talking about that is because slaves freed themselves. Enslaved people here in this country freed themselves. They are the ones who sacrificed, who put their bodies on the line, sometimes were killed, maimed, tortured for standing up against this brutal and inhumane system of slavery. And I think too much we don't talk about the history of resistance in this country. And so we want to spend a little time before even getting into the history of the emancipation process here in Maryland and talk about how slaves here in Maryland did resist, how they did stand up, how they were willing to use violence in order to push back. Also, as we're going through the history, if you all have any questions, comments, reflections, feel free to pop them into the chat and we will talk about them at the end. So even at the very beginnings of slavery, at the very beginnings of Maryland as a colony in 1634, slavery was introduced at the very beginning. At the very beginnings, when English people came here, they had Africans with them. And also at the very beginnings, we have historical records of people running away. At the very beginnings, in the 1600s, we already have those records. As early as 1629, there are colonial records mentioning people fleeing of service. And in 1639 here in Maryland, we have legislation that's very harsh for runaways. The colony passed the most severe laws of its kind at the time, declaring that runaways could be executed. And so what that says to us is not only were Africans running away at the very beginnings of this system of slavery, but it also says to us that it was a huge problem for slaveholders, that in order to keep people in bondage, they had to, have laws like putting people to death for trying to run away. And it signals how much of an issue it was for people who were trying to keep Africans enslaved. And so as historians go back and look at the fact that people were running away, it's very difficult to kind of get numbers on that. But John Hope Franklin, who is a great African-American historian, he estimated that as upwards of 50,000 Black people were escaping the South by 1860. That's kind of some of the closest numbers we have because, once again, it's very difficult to know these numbers. You can go to the next slide. Okay. So another way that slaves resisted, not just by running away, but was by having revolts. And usually Maryland doesn't come up in this conversation. You all may have heard of Nat Turner's revolt. You may have even heard of the Stono Rebellion, right? But typically Maryland area doesn't come up in these conversations. And the reason why is because it's actually really hard to find in our historical records here in Maryland about the rebellions that did happen. I was able to find two of them. One was on Easter of 1817, 200 enslaved people revolted in St. Mary's County, resulting in injuries to white people, and 2 homes were destroyed. The other that I was able to find happened on July 7th of 1845. Mark Caesar, a free Black man, and Bill Wheeler, who was enslaved, they and about 75 other Black people made their ways they started in St. Mary's, and they went all the way through Montgomery County and PG, and they were on their way to Pennsylvania before they were apprehended. Some of the local authorities, they actually got citizens together to stop them. But this was the first time in this area that people saw Black people rebelling very openly in public. They were in the streets, they were armed. They weren't, it wasn't at night. It was a very public thing, and it made headlines at the time. Also at this time, I want to talk about the fact that Mark Caesar was a free Black man, right? And I want to talk about the sizable free Black community that we had here in Maryland. Around the time of 1776, when this country, frees itself from England, we did have some slave owners here in this country who did free their slaves. Also, the tobacco, the system of selling tobacco, it was kind of falling apart by the mid-1800s, and that was the main cash crop that enslaved people were forced to produce. And so those things culminated by slaves resisting, meant that more and more Black people were being free. So we had this growing free Black community, especially in Baltimore. Baltimore had the largest free Black population in the country, in the South, prior to the Civil War. And the reasons why free Black people, not just in Maryland, but across the country, were so invested in ending the system of slavery is that because there were increasingly restrictive laws for the free Black communities here in Maryland and across the country. Things like you couldn't own a gun. If you were freed in Maryland, you usually had to leave the state. Your movements were restricted. If you lost your job and they could use vagrancy laws, you could actually be returned back to slavery. And so these are the reasons why, as long as the institution of slavery existed, even the free Black community was very much controlled by white communities. And they were also seen very suspiciously, because when you have Nat Turner's rebellion, because he was a free man in the 1830s, there's actually a whole list of free Black people that's made at that time in Maryland and Virginia. That's how much, the white communities were afraid of the free Black community. So I just wanted to name that. You can go to the next slide. So other ways in which Black people resisted slavery. So some of the things that they did came, to great risk to them, right? Like running away was a huge risk. Obviously, leading a revolt was a huge risk. But some of the things that people did, almost on a daily basis, was things that they could do to slow down work. Breaking tools and pretending to be sick were common things that would happen. And it was kind of difficult for slave masters to prove that these things were happening, but it was a thing that Black people did all the time. It was their way of pushing back and of reclaiming some of their humanity. Another thing that happened a lot is that whenever there was a war in this country, is that, Black people would join up with whoever was fighting against the United States and join the enemy lines in order to get freedom. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, a sizable amount of Black people fought on the side of the British, and some of them were given land in Nova Scotia. This was a common thing that happened, especially during the Civil War. You definitely have many people taking advantage of the Civil War and running away, of joining the Union Army as a way to free themselves. Another thing that happened is that people would destroy property. They used arson. They would sabotage crops. Theft. I don't even like using this word, because when you think about the fact that people were forced into working for free, not just them, but their children and their grandchildren, being forced to work for free. Many times slaves were given very small rations of food. They typically were always on the brink of starvation. So they did take things, right? Because they are being forced to work for free and not being paid for their labor. Another thing that happened was the poisoning of slaveholders and family members, and sometimes even infanticide. So you had women, Black women who would have access to food, right? They're the ones in the kitchen. They're the ones preparing the food. And sometimes they did poison their masters and their family members. In fact, we have a account of a woman. Actually, she's a teenager. She's only 14. Her name is Judah. We don't even have her last name. It's not even entered into records, but in the 1830s in PG County, she was accused of poisoning 3 of her master's children and for trying to burn his house down. We don't know if her confession was coerced out of her. There's very few details about what happened. We do know that she was hanged, but it's just an indication of that we do have records of Black people standing up in this way, of being willing to use violence, to use anything that they had to push back against this unjust system. So with that, we're going to watch a short film that it's only 8 minutes long, and it's going to give more of the history around the actual emancipation process here in Maryland.
Woodlawn Manor Cultural Park celebrates Maryland Emancipation Day. William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist, said, "Enslave the liberty of but one human being, and the liberties of the world are in peril." On November 1st, in 1864, Maryland emancipated Blacks who had been enslaved since the founding of the Maryland colony. In 1633, the ships Ark and Dove set sail from England. They arrived on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1634. When the colony of Maryland was established, most Blacks were treated as indentured servants who could work towards their freedom. When tobacco became Maryland's primary crop, more people were needed to grow the product. To that end, Maryland passed a law in 1664 enslaving Blacks and their children for life. These enslaved human beings were considered property. Frederick Douglass said of slavery, "The thought of only being a creature of the present and past was troubling. I longed for a future too, with hope in it. The desire to be free awakened my determination to act, to think, and to speak." Black men and women who were held in bondage sought only to be free. Many of these freedom seekers, like Frederick Douglass, self-emancipated themselves and eventually were assisted by abolitionists to escape bondage on the Underground Railroad. In Sandy Spring, Maryland, home to Woodlawn Manor Cultural Park, some Quaker settlers who founded the village freed those that they had enslaved in the mid-1700s. These free Blacks built a freemen's kinship community in Sandy Spring that still exists today. While there is no documented evidence, it is believed by some that some Quaker families and freed Blacks in the community supported freedom seekers on their journey north on the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass stated, "Civil war was not a mere strife for territory and dominion, but a contest of civilization against barbarism." On November 6, 1860, in an election that brought the new Republican Party to national power, Abraham Lincoln was elected president by a strictly Northern vote. 4 days later, on November 10th, Senator James Chestnut resigned his Senate seat and returned home to South Carolina to draft an ordinance of secession. The map shows the divisions in the country. The light blue states are called border states because these states during the Civil War created a border between the Confederacy and the Union. Maryland, in particular, due to its location near the capital, was of great strategic importance. President Lincoln's goal during the Civil War was to preserve the Union and prevent the Southern states from forming their own country. Ending slavery was not part of the original Union goals. In 1863, with the war still raging, Lincoln freed the slaves in the Southern Confederate to appease the Northern Union states who by majority had elected him to office. An additional reason for freeing those enslaved in the South was to encourage these new free men to fight for the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in states that were in direct rebellion to the United States. Maryland's Constitution of 1851 had forbidden passage of any law abolishing the relation of master or slave. To that end, Maryland had to write a new amendment to its constitution. Governor Augustus W. Bradford, in his annual message of 1864 to the General Assembly, sought passage of a constitutional convention bill in which the issue of slavery would be addressed. The predominantly Unionist legislature promptly complied, and the electorate approved the call for a convention. The Montgomery County delegation included Edmund P. Duval, Thomas Lansdale, and George Peter. The vote for emancipation for those enslaved in Maryland tipped in favor of abolition only after the absentee ballots of soldiers fighting for the North were counted. The final tally was 30,174 in favor of freeing the slaves and 29,799 against. On November 1st, 1864, Blacks enslaved in the state of Maryland were emancipated. No longer were Blacks legally bound to labor for another, deprived of the human right to be free, or considered no more than property. Article 24 of the document reads that hereafter in this state, there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except in punishment of crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, and all persons held to service or labor as slaves are hereby declared free.
Okay, I just want to recognize that we did get this clip off of YouTube from Montgomery Parks Organization, so we want to give them credit. And if anyone would like to pull up this clip again and watch it, for your own purposes, it is under Maryland Emancipation Day presentation. So if you would all like to watch that again. And at this time, we're going to be talking a little bit about the ways in which Black people celebrated the illegal ending of slavery here in Maryland. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Diane Kuthi.
Okay, it is my honor to introduce artist, educator, and scholar, Dr. Joan M.K. Gaither. Dr. Gaither is a lifelong resident of Maryland, and she's going to be talking about a community quilt that she created with over 400 Maryland residents to celebrate the 175th anniversary of the Maryland's Emancipation Day.
At any rate, the 1864 Maryland Emancipation quilt, we came together. I belong to a group, short NACAPS, Northern Arundel Preservation Society, and it came about to document our history. And one of the community activities that we did was this sesquicentennial quilt about Maryland slavery and emancipation. As you heard in the earlier slide, many of us had been taught pretty much that Lincoln's emancipation freed the slaves, but it only freed those slaves in those named Southern states in rebellion against the Union. that became our purpose of showing that Maryland individually sought their independence. And it became a reality November 1st, 1864. The quilt is designed in basically 3 parts. The top third of the quilt is in the colors of the Maryland flag. The bottom third is in the bottom part. Bottom colors are of the bottom half of the Maryland flag. The blue through the middle was meant to represent the schism that existed in the state, with so as many that were for getting rid of slavery. And it was just basically almost tied for those who wanted to keep it. But it also, the blue represents the role of Annapolis and the Chesapeake Bay. We know that we had 426 participants because one of our members made sure that each time we had a meeting and people came together, they signed in. And so we're very, very sure about that. And for any organization that deals with volunteerism, having and keeping track and documenting your volunteers translates into volunteer dollars. So that, we found was really important with 24 different community organizations. So what you see is these 24 squares, 23 counties and Baltimore City. And we distributed the quilt squares through, at that time, the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. So if you don't know about that, that's something that you can Zoom. They hold meetings usually on the first Monday of the month, and they are always open to finding out what's going on in Maryland that will help them to meet their mission of preserving the history in Maryland. And then around the edge, we came together, and I have to tell you, all I did was design the pieces and parts. And through the commission and their commissioners, we distributed the squares to the various counties through the commissioners. And they then found folks in their county or the city that were interested in telling the story of the people, places, and events in their particular area at this time from 1864 or immediately thereafter, to document any changes that had happened. Here, the center quilt square has the language and the words of that document, and the sides show sort of paths to freedom. And as you can see, the Maryland flag, it was important that as we did this quilt, that we put it together in such a way that is like a stage play. What's your setting? What does your stage look like? Where did this happen? So in each one of the squares, we asked folks to make sure they specifically gave the name of their county or city, that they showed their state seal. And each of the counties were asked to include a piece of railroad track fabric that would indicate the participation in the Underground Railroad. And then you'll also see a single star or 1 to 6 stars they were asked to use to make sure that when people saw the entire quilt, they would know that this was a story that belonged, this all belonged together. The Maryland design pattern you see around that are key lanyards that you hold your keys on. We just cut the metal part off and then stitched it there. So you know that this is a Maryland story. So if you go to the next slide. Yeah, so you can see more in detail each of the counties. So what is fascinating when you see the quilt, and you can see me there for the size, these quilt squares were 18 inches square. And again, they were distributed July the 5th. We asked for them back August 15th. And of course, you know, we only got 2 squares. So we extended the date until September the 15th. And we got all of the squares at a point that the people in our community came together and decided to put this together and then to use the framing that would sort of repeat some of the things that were reoccurring. On the far right side, almost near the bottom, you'll see a Maryland flag angel. Ruth Taylor is an artist here in Maryland who will design for my works specific quilts that, again, let you know what this is about. Next one. I think there's there's not a close up. Let's see if you can go back to the other one. Let me go back to the other one a minute. I was hoping that you could see some of the numbers, but the quilt right now is on display at the Riversdale Mansion Museum in Prince George's County. But in each of the squares, there are 2 sets of numbers. As you look at the square, the number on the right-hand side, on your left-hand side, represents those folks that voted to get rid of slavery. And on the right-hand side are the numbers of people who voted to keep slavery. The difference, as you saw, was like 375. It was a small number that this proclamation got passed, but it's important that it did. The quilt is 10 feet 4 inches square. And while we didn't get the pieces until September the 15th, it was all finished by October the 24th for us to have the unveiling at the State House on November 1st. So it took very little time. But the whole, I think the joy for me is that we were able to bring so many people together. So while there are only 24 squares, like Talbot County, they had 35 people to work on that square. 35 for that one 18-inch, but it was about the celebration and the sharing of the stories. So for me, this has been just a joy to see happen. And our goal was to be sure that this quilt would travel and be on exhibit in all of the counties and the city. And before we, took it down. So it's still traveling. And if you are interested in having it in your vicinity, you can contact me on the email, or just get back to Michelle or Diane, and we can do that. See, this picture here is at the Reginald Lewis Museum when it was on display in Baltimore. It feels like a lifetime ago. So, okay, next one. Diane, are you there? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So can we go to the next slide? I think that's all the images
Right.
that we have. Okay, great.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Actually, before we move on, just for one, I just have one thing that I'd like to ask you about, because sometimes you talk about the different themes that you found in all of the squares. Can you just mention that for just a second?
Oh, even though these squares were done in separate locations, when we came back to put it together, I'm always interested in what emerges, that emerging information. And what became significant looking at each of these was the appearance now of the right to worship, the establishment and growth of churches that became very evident. The role of the US colored troops was another piece that showed up on practically every one of the squares. And mind you, I didn't tell them what specifically to put on the quilt, but for them to address the heroes and heroines, the people, the places, the events that were significant at this particular time. And Frederick Douglass shows up, Harriet Tubman throughout, And it was the religious, this right to worship. In one of our squares here in Anne Arundel County, we have documentation of bush meetings where if you were going to come together, it was against the law in Maryland to convene like in the open like that. And so they had their worship services in the woods. And then afterwards, even though they were able to have churches, there had to be a white male present to make sure there was no conspiring going on at the time. So as these pieces came together, the story, also we found out that there are two counties on here where there are no numbers of vote because they had not been incorporated at that particular time. So there's lots of information that gets revealed through this process. And the museums now have access to new information because a lot of this documentation came from families and their own history and photograph and objects. So it's just the amount of information that comes about and the ability to come together and share that information.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Diane, did you have anything else to add?
I'm good.
All right, thank you, Diane. Thank you so much, Joan, for being here with us and sharing your beautiful work with us in celebration of the emancipation of Black people here in Maryland. Appreciate you. Okay, so another way in which Black people celebrated the legal ending of slavery here in Maryland was something that's now called Nace Hopkins Day. So Nathaniel Nace Hopkins was born into slavery in Trape, Maryland in Talbot County in 1830. In 1863, like we talked about, how a lot of Black people ran away, especially during the Civil War. In 1863, he freed himself and fought for the Union Army. And in 1867, he founded Trape's Emancipation Day to celebrate the legal ending of slavery in Maryland, which was on November 1st, 1864. And so he got members of the community together, and the first one that they had a church service, speakers, food, games, music, and a parade that went all the way from Trape through parts of Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. And so this is a tradition that he continued until he died 33 years later. He was completely committed to this celebration. And then when he passed, he was affectionately called Nace by the people in his community. And so that's why it's now called, the people of his community decided to then call it Nace Hopkins Day. And it continued up until 2019. I'm assuming it was paused, because of COVID, but it basically was celebrated up until present day. And so it is the longest continuous public Emancipation Day celebration on Maryland's Eastern Shore and one of the longest in the United States. So just want to acknowledge another way in which Black people celebrated this momentous occasion. Okay, so now we're going to transition into our discussion questions. We have some discussion questions here for you. We're going to invite you to journal, just to quietly and reflect on the history that was shared. Again, thinking about, what coming into this that you felt like you had been taught or what you felt like you knew, and just kind of reflecting on that. And we will give you all a few minutes to journal and reflect on the questions, and then feel free to pop questions, thoughts, reflections into the chat, and then we will discuss as a group. All right. So I see a few of you popped some thoughts into the chat. I'm seeing people talking about that they weren't aware that slaves in Maryland were actually freed after the emancipation, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Also seeing some comments about how close the vote was. It was actually tipped over by absentee ballots by Union soldiers. Yeah. Anyone else want to start us off on the discussion?
I was thinking about how in school, of course, I was in school a very long time ago, but when we learned that it was like Maryland was with the good guys, we were part of the Union. And even though many families were split with some brothers fighting for the Confederacy and some for the Union, but there always seemed to be this notion that we were different from those further south who had seceded. And I think, sort of the issue of enslavement actually being in Maryland was not brought to the fore during at least my era. And I think that is a history that still affects us today because people don't know their Maryland history. So sometimes we focus on national history, but what was happening in Baltimore, what was happening in Maryland is important for us to know that history because it is still affecting us today.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so so some comments that were shared that Lenny, are you from Maryland?
Most of my life.
Yeah, same. And so this idea that we were on the good side, we were the good guys, and actually during the Civil War, so most people don't know this, but Maryland probably would have seceded and been part. But the only reason why we didn't is, well, the main reason why we didn't is there was pressure because then DC would have been surrounded by the Confederate Army. So there was a lot of political pressure coming from Lincoln, coming from the White House to pressure Marylanders not to secede. People were put into prison who, were sympathizers with the South. I think I read somewhere that at one point here in Baltimore, we had what is it called? Cannons, being pointed at the Capitol. John Wilkes Booth was from Maryland, right? So he's buried here in Maryland. So as much as, I do agree that being a Marylander and being raised here in Maryland and what the impression that we're kind of given is that we were the good guys on the good side. I mean, that's not really what the history tells us, right? Anyone else?
I'm reading a book that's called Cash for Blood. So even though they outlawed international slavery going to Africa, Maryland was real complicit in the domestic slave trade.
Oh yeah.
Virginia were very instrumental in providing slaves for the South.
Mm-hmm.
The book that I have has almost 400 pages of the names of the enslaved, the ship that they were sent down south on, the ages and everything. So they had a vested interest in keeping it going because they were providing slaves. Now, the reason why they were Virginia and Maryland, one of the reasons that I learned was that at that point in Maryland, a lot of the so-called enslaved were domesticated. So therefore they could handle the rigors of what was necessary in the South. They were used to the language, used to the food of and things like that. So they were used to the American culture, language, and everything else. So they could fit well and work well down in the South. So Maryland and Virginia were quite complicit in the domestic slave trade.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I believe it's, I can't remember the exact year. I want to say around 1813 that the international slave trade ends, right? And then a lot of people don't know this, is that there is a strong tie between Baltimore and I'm not sure if all of New Orleans, but a lot of slaves here in Maryland were actually sent to New Orleans. A lot of people don't necessarily know that. There was actually a jail, I think it was somewhere along Pratt Street. And actually people were in, you know, were sent down Pratt Street, and people would come up to the I can't think today, the buggies and wagons or whatever, you know, and people were crying, and, you know, as their loved ones were being taken from Baltimore to be transported to New Orleans. And so a lot of people don't know that history either.
And the book Cash for Blood says it, the Baltimore to New Orleans domestic slave trade.
Yeah.
So Baltimore to New Orleans was definitely a route in which they sent a lot of the enslaved to the South, especially when the cotton became, you know, more prevalent and things like that.
Yes, thank you.
Maryland had a vested interest in keeping it going.
For sure, for sure.
Because I went to college in Fort Worth, Texas, I had direct experience with how the history was being taught in the South. And the textbooks literally said things like, the slaves were very happy with how they were treated by their owners. And it was really shocking to see that, even though my high school history in Illinois was not that great, it sure didn't go that far. And fortunately, I had a teacher for history in Fort Worth who was from Illinois and who pointed out the fallacies of what was said in the textbooks, which was a really good experience for me to realize that you can't just believe what you read in a textbook just because it is a textbook.
Mhm.
And it connects so much with what's happening in Texas now.
You know, that brings me to think about the sort of 4 questions that I have that underpin my own work and doing this work in the community. And it is, what is it that you think you know? How did you come to know it? Why do you believe it? And then how does that knowing and believing cause you to act? So I have been an advocate for more scrutiny of our educational resources, because if you only know what you've been taught and the resource you're using is flawed, that still is going to keep you going in another direction than following the truth. So often, you know, it's like you can say, what is it you think you know? But many times people aren't able to articulate how they came to know it, or even why they believe it in that. So I think that's why this group and the questions and the things that you have now, to me, are so very important, to get people to start to really think about what they believe they know and how they are either contributing to or trying to make this a better place.
Thank you, Joan.
I just wanted to mention something about the closeness of the vote, because several of you were surprised about that. It actually was even, it should have been even closer, because actually the people that voted, so it was 375, you know, affirmative, but you also had to be, in order to vote, you actually had to take an oath that you were supporting the union. So those people there were so many people that were supporting the union, yet they didn't want to end slavery in Maryland.
You have to realize that while Maryland was not one of the named Southern states, their economy absolutely depended on that free slave labor. So it was allowed to continue for economic reasons,
Mhm.
mostly. And I think that schism that existed then is really still very much in place
Mhm.
now, when you stop even and think about Baltimore City. And, I'm a product of what I refer to often as Jim Crow Baltimore, coming out of the projects that was built solely to contain you. But that lots of those covenants that were put in place to keep you from buying and investing in your community, many of them still exist today
Mhm.
in 2021. And they don't get the kind of attention, but the effect of them still very much in place.
Mhm.
Thank you for that, Joan, connecting some of the history to what's going on today.
Mhm.
That point about the economy also connects to me with the prison system in Maryland and how much of the economy and a lot of people's jobs uh, and the profits of the private industry uh, connects with that same pattern.
Very true. Thank you, Dottie. I saw a comment in the chat about what happened to slaves once they were freed. And I'll be honest, I didn't really get to spend a lot of time researching this because there was just so much history just in what we covered. But some of the things that I do know about, like for instance, Nathaniel, who we talked about, who started the celebration here in Maryland. He also, although he himself was illiterate, he actually helped start a school in his local community. We did have things like the Freedmen's Bureau and and other institutions of people who were coming together to start schools, because there were no public schools weren't really a thing in the mid 1800s, but they definitely were not a thing for Black people, right? So that was some people's first priority, was educating their children, since under slavery it was illegal to read, it was illegal to be educated. Another thing that newly freed enslaved did was look for people, right? Because under the institution of slavery, and unfortunately, people were separated so many times, right? Like if your master died, you go, usually the people on the plantation didn't stay together. They were sold to different places. People never saw people again. And so actually, if you look in historical records, there's ads that people put in papers looking for their children, for their spouses. There was a huge thing where people were trying to find their loved ones because they had been, torn apart during slavery. So those are some of the things that were happening, immediately after the ending of slavery.
Also, there's a history, if you wanted to look at the Julius Rosenwald schools. Julius Rosenwald, who was a partner of, vice president, I think, of Sears Roebuck. He and Frederick Douglass teamed up, and they're recognizing that there was a whole group of people that were left out of the educational school system. So Julius Rosenwald invested at age of 50, he invested $300 to communities to build a school for little colored children. But in that, we get a lot of talk about his $300, but what often is not talked about is the community's matching fund of $300 to make this happen. And there was a one-room school with one teacher. And Maryland has a number here in Anne Arundel County. We've done community quilts around those that are still have been repurposed, so to speak. But it's and also that the school system, this agreement was that the school system needed to be included, that school needed to be included in that county or district's schools so that it would go on in perpetuity. So, but that's another whole realm of investigation. And I think those books and records are held at Fisk, if I'm not, I could be wrong, but I think they're at Fisk to look at, and even to try to find those schools that are right here in your own district.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joan. Anyone else?
We know in Reconstruction,
I think there was a period of time when freed people who had been enslaved were supposed to be given a certain amount of land to farm, and it actually happened in certain places for a time. But they were given, I don't know if it was 50 acres or 5 acres. My memory's bad on this, but I just wondered if that happened in Maryland, if anybody knows.
I think it was supposed to be 40 acres and a
40
mule.
acres and a mule.
40.
But
40
from
acres
my-
and a mule.
Yes, but from my understanding, it was very limited and it was short term. And I
Right,
don't believe that was in Maryland.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't think it could be in Maryland because it was part of the reconstruction of the former Confederacy.
Right, right.
that's what I was just going to mention, that Maryland, since it wasn't one of the Confederate states, wasn't under the same sort of restrictions that the former Confederate states. So actually what happened is a lot of the Confederates came to Maryland because they felt that this was a state that was sympathetic. So it was very different than a northern state.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Diane. I didn't know that.
And I also wanted, I just want to mention one thing, because I read a lot before this. I didn't know about this before, but there is the Peel Museum, which is in Baltimore. It was the first public school for Black children in Maryland, and it was in the 1870s. And but what's really significant is that the free Blacks in Baltimore really organized because they had to pay taxes for the white schools.
Right.
So they organized to get that first Black school in Baltimore.
Yeah. 1814, I think.
It's 1814?
I think.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Anyone else? Questions, thoughts, reflections?
Elizabeth Lang was one of the founders of the School for Black Children, the Catholic. She started the order of, I can't remember the name of it, but she made sure that Black children were educated in Baltimore City. She and her the other sisters in her order.
Yeah, the parochial schools. Yeah.
Anyone else? Questions, thoughts, comments?
You know, I guess one of the questions I have is just even this notion of signifiers of identity. When we talk about, you know, Black kids or African Americans or people of color living through, you know, how to be correct, you know, in your language, but to realize that back in the day, at the time that these were colored children, and also being given signifiers of other horrible names that they carried colored up until the 1920s, late 30s. And then in the 40s, you became, quote, Negro, if you looked a certain way or had some color to your skin. And then staying Negro into the 50s, how we still condone these signifiers of identity for people who are of color. You became Black in the 60s, which was not capitalized. And I would tell you to go into your computer today and it won't let you put it in lowercase. You can put it in uppercase. Afro-Americans in the 70s was lowercase and hyphenated. The hyphen was taken away in the 70s, and folks, the signifier was Afro-American, that's now capitalized before becoming African Americans in the 1990s. But if you try to go back and strategically put those signifiers in time, in space today, the computer won't let you do it. As in the 60s, you had to override the computer in order to capitalize. You had to override the computer in the 70s to capitalize Afro-Americans. So there's so many things that we sort of live with and quietly perpetuate without even knowing it. When you can look at a person and not just think right away, you are one of these signifiers, as opposed to, here's another human, here's a person, and not have to even deal with those sort of issues of color. And then, you know, you come back to the history. It's like, where did we learn this? Why are we still perpetuating this?
Thank you, Joan. Yeah, I think that, you know, this conversation around the name changing and through time, I think it also speaks to the difficulty about how Black people, or not that, well, I would say this, the negative history about how we were called and that we didn't have any agency over it, right? The names that we were called and how we were labeled. And then through time, Black people having more agency, I think is part of why, you know, these names are changing. And also, I think the struggle to figure out your identity, right? If you're Adar, one of our founders here calls it the children of the Myalpha, the children of the Middle Passage, right? Some people are like, well, are we African? What are we, right? We're not really, you know, American in some ways, right? So I think it's also that struggle of dealing with your identity through time, after being forced here, after being stripped of your culture, of your language, and then figuring out how you want to name yourself, right?
I'm a person. I'm a person, first
Right.
and foremost. I'm a human.
Right.
And I just sort of reject that notion that somehow somebody else gets to say and define who I am.
Mhm.
You know, and it's always puzzled me, what are you? I'm not a piece of furniture, I'm not cattle, I am a person. And just trying to get to that point to help folks get beyond sort of this comfortable question of what are you or who are you? With the quilt that I just did for American women, I just said American women who are contributing to our society. They're all African women, quote, African American. And I was going to do 100. There are 266 faces on that quilt of women from all over. And I thought, we don't say white women contributing to America. These are women. These are American women. So it's, again, coming back to, what is it you think you know? Why do you know it? How did you come to know it or believe it? And how and why are you continuing to perpetuate whatever this is?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, that's the question that I'm constantly going after, particularly if someone else is in a very comfortable position of trying to define who and what you are. Because if they do that, they then also control and define what you can and cannot do.
True.
So I'm quiet.
All right. Thank you, Joan. Anyone else have any questions, comments, reflections?
I was curious if anybody knows like who were the organizations contributing to doing organizing to get out the vote to convince Marylanders who maybe were not sure how they wanted to vote on this issue. Because I imagine people went and spoke at churches and maybe door knocked or, you know, wrote letters to the editor, but just wondering like who were the kind of abolitionist groups maybe at the time that were doing this sort of on the ground organizing.
I did not come across that in my research. Frederick Douglass is from Maryland. I know, I'm not sure that he was doing organizing work in Maryland at that time. I know later he was. Does anyone else?
Yeah,
Diane?
I don't know the specific groups, but I do know that that Baltimore Heritage has done a civil rights history of Baltimore. And there's a lot of really good information about different churches organizing. So I don't know if it was specific for this vote, but for the school that I mentioned, that's where I found that, and other lots of organizing here in Baltimore.
Do we know who was allowed to vote?
White men that
White men.
pledged allegiance to the Union.
They didn't have to own property.
Not at that point in time. Yeah. And I don't know. And so my question is there, and Joan, you might, with the absentee vote that, from the soldiers, were those, were they all, because there was quite a few troops here, that black troops, were they in that vote or not?
In Parole, just outside of Annapolis, Parole, Maryland. And that's where the fort was, or the base was. So they happened to be here nearby and, right there. So that accounted for the greater percentage of that vote that pushed them to win.
So was it just white soldiers, or you're saying?
They were all the parole, the US colored troops were in parole. So the soldiers could vote. And that's what contributed to that winning number, even though how slightly close it was. But they were right there at Annapolis. Do you know where Parole is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right there beside Annapolis. But they were there, and they were there in large numbers. So they were allowed to vote, which I find very interesting. But they were allowed to vote.
But they didn't have to be white to vote. Okay.
No, they were part of the army.
Yeah, I'd have to do more. I'm not sure about that history. I know that it's not until after the Civil War that Black men are given the right to vote. So I'm not sure if there was a loophole here in Maryland, but typically it was white men who were voting.
Right.
Prior to the Civil Rights Act that's passed in the 1870s, I believe. Any other questions, comments, reflections? All right, well, we do have some information about some exhibits that are happening in the area that kind of continue this conversation. If you all found this interesting, you want to learn more of that history. Diane, do you want to speak a little bit about the two events that you found?
Well, I haven't been to either one, but I want to go. So there's just these two exhibitions that are currently happening that I thought worked with our theme today. So Freedom Bound, Runaways of the Chesapeake, and that's in Annapolis at the Banneker Douglas Museum. And I think maybe Joan had already gone to that. And then From Enslavement to Emancipation, Voices Not Heard. And there's apparently, which I never knew about this, Maryland Museum of Women's History. It was online, but now it's in person now. So
thank you, Diane. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all for coming, for sharing in this history today with us. I always say, people could be doing lots of things, and we always appreciate when you all join us to learn more about our history. In America, there's so much history that we're not taught in schools. Unfortunately, we have to do the work of uncovering a lot of that history, of doing a lot of that research. So we thank you all for joining us during the space of doing that. Once again, if you would like to donate, please feel free to do so. You can donate at bemoreantiracist.org. We are a nonprofit, so we always appreciate anything that people would like to give. Also, if you want to take a minute and follow us on social media, please feel free to do that. Is Toya still with us? Toya, did you put in the chat information about your organization?
I'm still here. and I didn't, but I will.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna let Toya take a second and put her information. I follow her organization. I was telling her I've not been able to make it out yet, but if you all would like to follow that, feel free to do that as well.
When do you meet again?
So we have a planning committee, which I am on, that does our actual our regular meetings. And then we have community events. And so I don't know when our next community event will be, because we like to hold a lot of our things outside, and it's starting to get cold. So they'll probably start up again once it starts getting warm again. However, if there are some that will be organized, they will be up on the website, which is why I gave the website there. Keep in mind that we are a band of Black practitioners of a Black tradition. And so most of what we do, there are some things that will be open to the public and we will identify those, but most of what we do is spiritual work. And so we are only inviting people who are a part of the tradition or who want to be a part of the tradition to participate in spiritual work. We don't our events are not, they are not for people to come and view us or just wanting to learn what hoodoo is. We are actually people who are practitioners. So, but the information, the link to the website is in the chat. So if you are interested in being a hoodoo practitioner, or if you are one and are looking for community, we are available.
Thank you so much, Toya. Okay, with that, we're going to go ahead and close. Thank you all for coming, and we will see you next month. We will be discussing the movie on Netflix called Passing. If you get a chance and you would like to read the book, it's a short book. It was written during the Harlem Renaissance by Nella Larson. Feel free to read the book and watch the movie on Netflix, and join us on December 13th as we discuss that. Thank you, everyone.